see everyone. I'm excited for today's conversation as we've got people starting to join us via Zoom and people joining us on LinkedIn. We're talking today about, I still think other than people getting laid off, it's probably the hottest topic in SaaS, right? Which is PLG and what does it mean? What does it mean for salespeople? Product-led growth, I think, is a sector it's been around for forever. Really, it's not like necessarily a new sector. We used to call it, I know this, Brendan, this might be sacrilege. We used to call it freemium, but you can't. It's different. It's got to be product-led growth, right? Like account-based marketing is brand new as well too. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today. I've got a couple of great gentlemen with me to talk about this, people that are deep into it from the tech standpoint, people that are deep into it from a practitioner. Nick, I'm really glad that you joined us. I love the practitioner concept and side of this as well too, from people who aren't just building software or pontificating like me as well. So I think it's going to be a pretty lively conversation. And we're going to talk about a lot of different things, product-led growth. If you all have comments, I'm going to be monitoring them in the Q&A. If you've got them on LinkedIn, feel free to drop them in the comments. The team will kind of drop them for us to pick up as well. And so without further ado, why don't you two give like a quick, 15, 20 seconds on who you are and your relationship to the PLG game. Brendan, if you want to kick us off.
Sure. Hey, thanks for having me, Jake. Appreciate it. Excited for the conversation. I am the co-founder and CEO of Groundswell, and we are helping salespeople at PLG companies prioritize who they should be reaching out to so they can focus on the right companies and the right people at the right time. I was at Zoom prior to this, helping the BDR org over there, doing operations and enablement. So I've kind of seen this firsthand within a company at scale doing PLG. So excited to chat with everyone today.
It's going to be a fun one. Mr. Nick.
Hey, great to be here. Nick Acre. I'm an enterprise account executive at Loom, and I joined 2.5 years ago as our third AE when really we were just coming out of beta with the first version of Loom. And since then, we've built a sales team and sales organization on top of Loom's really strong PLG motion. And I'd say, like, being a little provocative, I am proof why salespeople will not be replaced by product-led growth. And we can dive into more around why.
I love it. Exactly. And you're somebody who's in it, you're living it as well. So let's just start. We didn't have this on there, but Brendan, I'm going to toss it to you first. Why don't you define, like, what is product-led growth to you, and like what isn't it? So when you think about, you hear the term PLG, product-led growth, like I made a couple of little comments up front, but what is it to you? And then what are the kind of maybe common misconceptions around it?
Yeah, totally. So, and this is kind of one of those things, it is fairly early. There is new tooling and new ways of doing PLG. Now, freemium has been around for 10, 15 years. Like, that is nothing new. But I think that the tooling and the infrastructure and the way that people are going to market is changing. And so I think that said, like, if you'd ask 10 people what the definition of PLG is, even if those people are at PLG companies, you'll get 10 different definitions. My definition is basically just that the product is one of, or the primary way of going to market, meaning people can go to your website, they can sign up, they can get a little taste of what you do, maybe not the whole thing, maybe there's gated features, or maybe there's other products within the suite that they may not have access to, but ultimately you can start trying the product before buying the product. I'd say the second piece of that is, just to reiterate, and I'm glad we're just getting this said up front, like, PLG does not mean it replaces salespeople. Again, I was at Zoom, there's 1,500 salespeople there. They weren't just twiddling their thumbs. So there's definitely a need to have salespeople at PLG companies.
Of course. So that kind of gets us into it. So I think that's a great, kind of starter for a lot of people, which again is the idea that the product is going to be able to get to a certain level of stickiness, let's call it. Mm-hmm. And that is kind of the focused or lead motion. I think is to me, that's what it means to me as well too. And so, Nick, I'll have you kind of kick us off here around, product-led growth, replacing salespeople, salespeople in the loop. We do a lot of work with companies, and a lot of it's about, when to get the salesperson involved. But for you, Nick, living it firsthand as a seller in a PLG-led company, why would you say it won't replace the need for salespeople? Whenever I think, I mean, I'm not speaking for all engineers, but I feel like a lot of engineers would like that. The product's just so good. Why do you feel, or from what you're seeing in your own role, that salespeople are still and when they're still mission critical to the process?
Yeah. I think it's not a question of whether you have PLG, whether you have sales or you have product-led growth. I think it's a sequencing question. For a lot of companies, you start with building a bottoms-up motion where people adopt your tool. There are so many developer-facing tools. Developers can connect to an API and build stuff like, let's say, with Twilio. So there's a lot of room where companies can grow to a certain scale. But at one point, the CIO or the CEO or the CFO, they're not going to buy a $100,000 ARR contract from a company on a credit card. And the reason they won't do it is because there's other considerations that come in. There's SLA requirements, there's having a master services agreement in place. The simple thing of, do we need, what's the point of upgrading to any sort of an additional tier? So if I were to simplify why salespeople are needed, it's no CIO is waking up in the morning, no CFO is waking up in the morning and being like, oh, you know what? All of these developers using Twilio for free or using it on their credit cards. Now let's go centralize everybody. Let's formalize this. Let's build a process around it and spend $100,000 with Twilio. That's the role of the salesperson, where I come into the picture and folks like me come into the picture. We learn from people that are already using it so we can understand what the value is, and we can relay that to the economic buyer and then help them make a decision around, okay, now it's time for us to centralize this, formalize this, and let's go and create a more formal relationship with Twilio or whoever.
Got it. So it sounds like for you, it's like you said, it's the order of operations that, maybe before it was a salesperson was driving all adoption, but for certain, again, products in this category, the salesperson's coming in once there's some type of, algorithm or critical mass of some types. And Brendan, what about for you? What are you seeing with your clients in terms of when they're bringing salespeople in, how they're thinking about salespeople, both at the enterprise level, down to mid-market?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is also, even within a company, there's a spectrum, right? So there's a journey that a company goes on to become kind of fully deploying PLG strategies, right? So they might be layering salespeople on top of their bottom-up strategy, right? They may also be creating segments within their company, right? So their SMB or mid-market departments might actually be separate than their enterprise, and there might be a bifurcation of strategy between those two different segments within their account base. The other thing to mention here, the other dynamic is there's SDRs, AEs, there's also CSMs and AMs at PLG companies, where you have to figure out, who is going to own the upsell or the cross-sell or the renewal, right? And so making sure that you're orchestrating, not externally, but also orchestrating internally the right motions to actually put the buyer and the customer first, as opposed to, just kind of going in with the traditional top-down motion, setting up first meeting, running a 90-day sales cycle, closing deal, throwing it over the fence to the CSM or whoever. Now I think there's actually more of a flywheel than a funnel. And I think this is way better for the buyer, by the way. I think PLG and this new way of selling is advantageous to the buyer. So I think it's a net benefit for everyone.
Yeah. And what do you feel like are some of the differences then? So Brendan, you can kind of start us off okay, so this idea of bottoms up sales or top down, this is not not like a new concept. So what do you feel are like some of the major differences between a what somebody might consider a traditional sales process and a PLG selling when it comes to, outbound, the discovery conversations? Like, what do you see as being kind of the big differences?
Yeah, totally. So I'd say there's three major differences off the top of my head. So there's number one, there's the discovery, which you just mentioned. I think discovery is crucial. You have to do deep discovery to actually understand where they're at in the buying process. The analogy here is like, there's content marketing that popped up 10 or 15 years ago or whatever. Like when somebody comes into the funnel who has already done a bunch of research, even if it's just via content, you need to meet them where they're at, right? So they might already have a little bit of knowledge. You don't want to start them at step one of your product. They're already at step three, so you need to meet them there. This is the same thing with PLG, right? They might be using Loom for 6 months, and you actually want to meet them where they're at and say, hey, you already have some information. The second piece is around the sales process. And Nick, you can obviously speak to this better than me, but in selling, I think you need to be able to be able to get stakeholders involved and also play this game of like, I want to gather information from certain users, those PLG, those free users, but maybe I'm actually not selling those people. I'm having conversations and I'm information gathering. I'm packaging that up into a narrative, and then I'm taking it to their boss, to the VP of that department, whether it's IT or otherwise, and that's very different. And then I think that the third one is more on the account management side and how you're actually doing those renewals, those cross sells, those upsells, to know when is the right time to go in and say, hey, there's these other two products that you haven't ever touched, even though you've been using our product for 6 months, right? Or there's these other features. And, based on our customers, after using, product one, 6 months later, product two and product three might make sense. Let's have a conversation about that. And so I think these nuances are subtle, but super important versus kind of the traditional, here's my playbook, here's my talk track, I'm just going to go sell. In the PLG world, it's really, you need to do deep discovery. You need to understand some of that is enablement, and then some of that is around the tooling, which is obviously what Groundswell helps with.
Yeah, and I think, Nick, I'm going to pass it to you. I mean, my comment on that too is I think one of the issues I see in the PLG companies that we work with is the sales team expects decision makers to actually know that people in their company are using it too, and that in what I've seen in PLG is you've got the whole spectrum from people that, you're right, like they're actively in it, they've been spreading it throughout, and others where it's a big company and they're like, that's great that 50 people are using it over here, like I really don't care, like this isn't a top priority for me. And I think that to me is, I think, one of the unique challenges of PLG is I see a lot of sales teams that are like over engineered to be like, oh, about us, and the person's like, I got no clue. So I think that's just a nuance that a lot of companies need to try to fight to combat, is a sales org that gets, I call it almost like sloppy. It's like they just expect that somebody knows what they're doing. And then, they struggle to get that roll up deal because it's not a top priority at the executive level or even, director level. So for me, I think that's a big one. And you talked about like a level of intent too. Nick, for you, someone who's done both, like, what do you see as the big difference, from a PLG, whether it's around the outbound process and who you target, to the discovery and early stages of the sales process?
Yeah, I'll try and break it down into some parts. So one, there's a venture firm called OpenView. They wrote an article a few years ago, pretty famous, about like the different eras of computing. And one of the things they described is, back in the day, if you go into the 90s during the desktop era, historically, me, the salesperson, would be cold outbounding to the CIO, and the CIO would make a decision to buy a software as a perpetual license for the entire organization. And the CIO makes the decision. Maybe there's like a few people in the CIO's team, but it's ultimately the CIO. So the salesperson I was taking them out to steak dinners or taking them out to baseball games. Then came SaaS, and it became more of a customer success model, but still it was very much like executives were deciding. Then started the freemium era, where Dropbox was, I think, a really early example of this, where Dropbox was being adopted by people and they were bringing it from their personal to their workplace. So the role that I played during the discovery phase of this, to your point, Jacob, yeah, the executives don't necessarily know how or why people are using, like, let's say Loom. I'll give you an example of a deal I had last year. It was with a pretty well-known virtual whiteboarding tool that folks might be familiar with. And what was going on was their IT team had upgraded a few folks to Loom's business plan, say 400 people on the business plan, all organic, no sales involvement. Pretty good. I mean, if you think of customer acquisition costs, Loom didn't have to pay anything. This company went from paying nothing to 400 users on the business plan. Where I stepped in now is identifying who are the users in that 400 business plan category that were using Loom the most and why. So those are the people that I reached out to and spoke to and basically did interviews with. And I'll get really tactical here on how I approach these people. So rather than going and being like, I want to sell you an enterprise, because they don't give a shit really. My tone was, hey, you're the expert, you're using Loom, I'm trying to learn, would you be open to helping me? That's it. Literally, that was the tone. It was, are you open to helping me? And you'd be surprised that, and I did like a lot of A/B testing in my outreach sequences, where the first iteration of my outreach sequences was like all of these features, like trying to start a conversation about enterprise, crickets. And as my outreach sequences became simpler and the tone changed to, you're the expert, you're using Loom, I'd love to learn, suddenly people started responding. And I think the takeaway for me was, when someone is using your product, they don't need to be sold on new features, but they're willing to help because they have an emotional connection with your product. So if you come from that approach, whatever tool it is, it could be a developer tool, it could be a Loom or a virtual whiteboarding tool, power users are generally willing to help. So then when I speak to them, it's like, okay, let's go back to, what was the problem you were hoping to solve with Loom? Walk me through that problem. What did it look like pre-Loom? What does it look like now? Let's try and quantify the impact of this change that you've made. And that was the work that I did by speaking to, in the case of this account, by speaking to 10 different people. There were product managers, designers, there were a few salespeople, a few people in customer success. That helped me build a story. Now, I took that story and that narrative and then cold outbounded to the VP of IT as like, hey, Mr. VP of IT, you're familiar with Loom. I don't need to tell you about it, but here's what I've learned. Your team is actually recording some really sensitive content. PM's recording the product roadmap, engineers talking about the code that they're reviewing. And that information is fundamentally living in a public forum right now. How do you think about that as a leader of IT and security? Would you want to talk to me about how we can help you there? So that was the message, and that led to the VP of IT responding, setting up a call, and sort of a cold outbound message converting into a deal from there. So yeah, I'd say like that's generally the flow that you take in PLG. You learn from folks, you build a narrative, you quantify the impact, then you go and tell that story to leaders. Because now imagine like I as a rep is coming and being like, here's why your team is using it, here's the benefit. Let's talk about how we can scale this benefit, or depending on the account, we can sort of change that message.
Yeah. And I would argue that too, like that's also good enterprise sales in general, right? Like is to like go and talk to business unit leaders. So for people that are doing like traditional cold outbound, that strategy also works, right? Like the ability to go in, talk to different people in the business, understand things that are bubbling up.
100%.
But I think you just don't have quite the same ammunition when you get there. What have you seen? And, Nick, I'll stay with you. Like, how do you know, or like, what are the right signals to look for, right? Because XY people that have an email address that have signed up, are there signals at Loom that you all look for to know these are the types of people that we engage with? Like this is when it's the right time. Because that's a big covenant, of product-led growth, is like you're kind of trying to time the right time when you've got like whatever that definition of critical mass is. And Brendan, I know you'll have an opinion on this, but Nick, like what do you all use at Loom to decide this is the type of account that we want to engage with based on, their usage or other metrics?
Yeah. I'll say first, there are a ton of parallels between like classic top-down enterprise sales and a PLG enterprise sales. And some of those parallels are you define your ICP, especially at a startup. You don't want to go and sell to the world. You want to sell to like a narrow group of people who you know have their early adopters of a new technology like Loom. So define your ICP, know which personas use Loom the most and why, because then you can tell relevant customer stories. In the case of Loom, for example, I know, and I'm very honest with people about this, that product design engineering end up being the most powerful Loom users. And consistently in most companies we see, these are the folks that bring Loom into their organization. Sales and customer success, people traditionally think that would be the role, but for us, there are just some reasons why we're not the best fit for that. So what I try and do is focus my time on my ICP and my persona, which is product design and engineering. And over time, I've built, like, speak with other product designers and engineers that, like, what does their day look like? What are the different things they do so that I can speak intelligently about, here is a use case for a designer, and I'm not just a salesperson. So I'd say like start there, and then comes in data. So if you're in a PLG company and you're doing the first two, and then you're not bringing data in, then I think you're just harming yourself. You're just like you're not making use of this really valuable information that should inform your outreach. So the way I use data is every product has some signals that tell you which users are getting most value from their products. In the case of Loom, for example, it's how many videos are people creating, how many videos have been watched, how many comments people left on their video. So little things like that tell us that, okay, this person is a heavy user, and now I should go and reach out to them and try and learn.
Is there like a critical mass though, Nick? I mean, like, do you think about it like, okay, so I'm reaching out to an enterprise org, and they've got 5 people on the product team that are using it. Like, how do you know, or like, are there things that you all have kind of triangulated around that, like, there's whether it's like they use expanded feature sets, or you've got 2% of a department? Are there any things that you guys look at to kind of triangulate around, like, the volume or the quality of usage that equals, okay, now we're ready to go, outbound?
Yeah. I'd love to say that, like, we're that advanced, and yeah, we look at like all these fancy metrics. The reality is that partly why Brendan and Groundswell exist is a lot of that tooling doesn't exist. So it's very elementary, and there's a lot of trial and error. Generally speaking, yeah, like, I don't want to go and talk to a 10,000 person company with 2 people using Loom. So you over time, you'll build a pattern around, like, okay, in a 10,000 person company, if there are 200 people using Loom, and of those 200, like, 50 or 20 are within the product organization or design organization. I'd say, like, that's directionally where my head goes, and how the sales team at Loom operates. We're still pretty early. We're less than 2 years old as a sales organization, so we're really building those like here are the clear signals when you should go out.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think there's a lot of companies. Canva comes to mind. There's a few others that have kind of had some missteps as a part of this as well too, as they think about like the intent signals. And Brendan, obviously you kind of have created a product that's in this world. Are there, across your companies or talking to orgs, are there different, for the layperson out there who might not be using a Groundswell or something, are there themes that you've seen or anything that you all have noticed from the data in terms of like what makes somebody high intent or the right lead?
Yeah, totally. And I think this is, again, not to dodge the question, but like the reality is it depends, right? It depends on the company. It depends on the stage in which they're kind of doing PLG, the size of the company, a lot of different factors. I would say, like, you should also eat, like, the best companies, Loom, Zoom, Figma, like these companies, don't have it figured out, and they have data science teams building things around this
Mhm.
internally, or they have spent a lot of time doing it. So if you don't have some, perfect algorithm that's fine tuning every single lead that comes into your Salesforce instance yet, like, don't worry about it. I would just say start somewhere. You've probably got some sort of hypothesis of what activation looks like in your customer base, or what that aha moment is. So maybe it's, in the enterprise, 5 people on the product team, right? Start there. Make sure that you can see how many companies today have hit that threshold of 5 users. And maybe there's 7 of those companies that meet that criteria. I would call that a product qualified account, right? A PQA, similar to a product qualified lead, which is on the contact side of things. Just build that out and let it run for 30 days. Just do it in some brute force manual way that you're putting this data in front of reps. You can do this with a BI tool like a Looker or Tableau, just to get it in front of them. You can push this data into Salesforce so that they can see it there, and then take action against it, right? And see what happens. See if that does convert at a higher clip. But yeah, the reality is, like, there's not really a set metric across all companies, because it is going to be different and nuanced for every company, right? So for Loom, it's number of videos viewed, right? For Zoom, it's number of meetings held week over week. And so for your business, you just need to think about what is the most important metric, or maybe 2 or 3. You don't have to overcomplicate it, but basically there's between 1 and 3 metrics you should think about, and just start there and set a threshold and say, okay, this is when this threshold is met, that becomes a PQL or a PQA.
Yep. Yeah. And I agree. I think for a lot of orgs, it's just doing that. It's figuring it out. Is it just, it could be number of logins, but I mean, the cool part is, for most of your orgs, it's not infinite, right? There's probably just certain criteria that you can kind of triangulate around.
Frankly, it should be like 1 or 2 things. Don't overcomplicate this. Don't come up with, like, because then your salespeople will be spending time in dashboards and not selling. So, keep things simple as well.
Number of users has to be in the mix, though, right? Like, it's not, I mean, again, it's like we're having this conversation. I was like jotting some notes. I'm like, it's not really product-led growth if like 5 people at a 5,000 person company are using the product, and then you're going outbound. Like, that's not really product-led growth, right? And I think that's maybe like a disconnect between, that's freemium, like in my mind. Like, that's just like people using a free product. It's not actually the product leading to the growth, which I think is a kind of an interesting thing for maybe, companies to think about, that, the amount of penetration or percent penetration in a key department has to be a metric, right? Like, it has to be on the list.
Yeah, I think it's number of users, and then it's also the usage. So you might have 5 users that are really power users, and then it's like, okay, we need to go into that company and spread the word because they're getting a ton of value out of it. That's the other kind of metric that I would look at is users, but then also usage within that user base. But yeah, certainly if there's a small number of users, like, that's an intent signal. You could say, okay, maybe there's something going on in this company, I'm going to go sell into it. But like, I would much rather have 500 users at a 10,000 person company. You need to figure out what that threshold is.
Product-led growth, right? Like, Brendan, like, it's not product-led growth if you have 5 users in a 5,000 person company, unless, again, the total department's 50, and like you've got like, to your point, right? You've got like power users. It's not really product-led growth. It's just like you got some people that are kind of using it. You don't even have enough data points to like take it up. So I think it's just a good call out for companies out there to think like, true product-led growth equals product-led growth, right? PLG. And so let's get more tactical. So I can kind of continue down this path. But let's get more tactical in terms of how you, and Nick, you gave a tease to this about some of the messaging that you use. Maybe you can just like elaborate a little bit more on, when you're putting that case together, again, you kind of found the simplified messaging around product feedback. It sounds like that's been a good tool at the end user level to kind of gather that. And then Nick or Brendan, either one, what have been some other techniques to like get those people internally as, either champions or at least data sources?
So you can do this one by one. Reach out to what we typically call power users and learn from them. If you want to do it at scale, I've actually seen this done really well on the Loom mid-market team that I'm sort of stealing from one of our team members. They put together like a little 3 to 5 question survey. And as part of their email outreach, they just like the third or the fourth step of the email sequence. The first couple of steps are asking for time. And then if you're not getting that time from the user, then we just go like, hey, get it, you're super busy. Would you be able to help by just answering these 3, 4, 5 quick questions around your usage? The reason I'm doing this is to help your leaders understand the value of Loom or why you're using something like that. And so that helps us collect feedback at scale. And then we can, sort of put that into like a pretty little slide around, look at the NPS of Loom, look at like all these amazing use cases that your team has unlocked on their own without any help from us. So I say like that could be a tactic that I think that can work for really most PLG tools. It's not unique to Loom per se. I'll pause there.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, like a quick survey. Again, it's all about like gathering some data. And like you said, the people that really are evangelists will want to be, part of that. What about you, Brendan? What are you seeing with your clients in terms of ways to engage like the frontline people to kind of help to make your case?
Yeah, I definitely would just echo what Nick said. I think the other thing that I've noticed and heard from AEs and sales managers is really being kind of using a little bit of discretion. It's a bit of a delicate balance between trying to go sell to the user's boss, because at a certain point, like there's, if I go to a power user and say, hey, I want to get a little bit more information because I want to go sell, $100,000 deal to your boss, to some extent, like that can be a little bit of a threat to that power user. They may think,
Totally.
oh, well, I don't want to get this shut down, right? Like I've been using this. I don't even know if my boss knows I've been using it. I don't want this taken away from me. And so you do have to kind of balance what you're doing there and navigate that, and make that power user look good, right? Like it's kind of a psychological thing, but you do need to make that power user look great to their boss, right? And so putting yourself in their shoes, how can you make them look good and present to their boss and say, hey, Sally over here has been using this for 3 months. Look at all these awesome results she's been able to get by implementing this tool. We think that if you expand from 50, users to 500 users, you'll be able to actually see a significant increase. And here's some other benefits when you do that. So that's the other thing that I would mention in that outreach, is just to make sure that you're not stepping on the toes of those power users, because ultimately, like that is your path into selling that bigger deal.
Exactly. Yeah, that's such a good call. That's why, like when Nick gave his to the CIO, I was like, man, if I was an end user in that organization, I'd be getting heartburn. I'd be like, this guy's sharing, like, here comes the email. But look, that's part of sales, right? Part of sales is being challenging and being okay with that. Because I think it's actually a really great one. But I think what you're saying, Brendan, to kind of counterbalance that is to really think about kind of the combination of both, right? You want to keep that momentum going and then finding the right way to bring it up the chain. Any other ways that you've had success, Nick? So you talked before about kind of the ways that you engage the front line. You gave that great one, the challenger kind of one about, hey, are you worried about this? Any other success techniques you've had on kind of bringing it up the chain? You gather the information, like tactical, like messaging, or things that you always talk about in the first conversation, or ways to avoid what Brendan talked about, which is like getting your end users in trouble.
Yeah. I think end users, at least in my experience with Loom, I haven't seen them be super worried because maybe the dynamics of the tool, whatever. We don't have to worry about that. I think I do want to touch on champions. There's a lot of confusion in sales around what makes a champion. A power user does not necessarily equal a champion, because I think for me, there's two really clear things. They could love the product, they could want you to be successful, but then the second big question is, do they have influence in the economic buyer? And if they don't have influence in the economic buyer, then they're a coach. And the way I partner with a coach is having them coach me. And I'll ask something very simple like, hey, I'm new to your organization. You're like the second person I've spoken to. So I'm really just trying to learn. Can you give me some advice on how does your company typically evaluate tools like Loom? What do your leaders care about? What's top of mind strategically? What's like the biggest change? And I'll do some research. I won't just ask an open-ended question. For example, one of the big secular trends that's taken place over the last year in the world of work is the shift to remote. That fits in perfectly with Loom. So I'll do some research on the account before I speak to the user, and I'll be like, I noticed that you guys went remote a year ago. How's that going? What's the feedback from the team? I hear from other teams that people are spending too much time in Zoom calls. Are you seeing that at all? So I'll gather that information. Once I've done that, again, like enterprise selling is a team sport, so you don't have to do all of this on your own. Like, let's say I learned from a group of product managers. See if anyone in your product organization has common connections with people in the product organization of your target account. And even if they don't, what if you have mutual venture capital connections? What if, and even if you have none of those connections, that's a great way to bring an executive connection in, where I will prepare a summary for, say, my VP of product, my head of product, and then have my head of product reach out to the accounts head of product, so that it's an executive connection. And the message is really like, hey, learn from my team that your PMs are using Loom really heavily for XYZ use cases. I'd love to learn from you how, we can expand that, or whatever the message is. And I've just found that when you bring in an executive with a helpful tone and not like, we want to sell enterprise here. The buyer on the other side is likely going to be more open to having a call, and then obviously, like, in the background, I'm working with them to prepare for the meeting.
Yeah, I think that's a good call too. Look, with product-led growth, there are just going to be some accounts that are always going to be kind of a like continued, and Brendan, no pun intended, groundswell. But I do feel like that's one of the issues I see sometimes at the enterprise is we become overly obsessed with only top down. And, I'll give a kind of a personal example. I had at the time, it was the largest private hospital system in California as a client. And, we had a good, decent, corporate contract. But at the end of the day, it was 10,000 at this hospital extra, 20,000 here, 15 here, to grow it to a big 6-figure, borderline 7-figure account. And so I think for a lot of people in product-led growth, understand that you're going to have an enterprise in general, you're going to have both. You're going to have clients where you are going to it, or where you're starting to just create more groundswells, and maybe there'll be a roll up, maybe there won't. And maybe you'll get the big corporate deal or you won't as well. And that kind of leads me to got a couple more questions here. Maybe Nick, this one might be a good one for you is, how do you guys at Loom, Brendan, you teased this in the beginning. How do you handle who owns the sale, right? Like, is it a sales person owns the account? Is it account management owns growth? Like, how do you all think about who owns growth, and does that change throughout someone's life cycle in a PLG setting?
Are you talking about like post-sale, after the first sale is done?
Well, I define post-sale, right? Like, in a PLG, it's like, cool, we closed like a part of a group, or we did a borderline roll up, right? Yeah. Like, how do you guys define the sale, right? Because hypothetically, there could be this department or group is using it, and then this one, and then we're, going up.
Yeah. So there are 3 functions that map to the customer journey at Loom. There's self-serve. For simplicity, self-serve is when someone is buying Loom without talking to a human being. If someone comes inbound, and even if they might come inbound for, hey, we want to buy 100 licenses on the business plan, but they're coming inbound to us, that falls into the sales-led funnel. And then the third is like customer success, which historically at Loom has owned expansion, upselling, and renewals. And as we're growing, we're constantly evolving this. So where we are now is, let's say I closed a 200 seat deal at an account with 2,000 employees. There's way more room for Loom to grow because we're a horizontal tool versus just for product or engineering. So I will partner with my CSM, and the both of us will figure out, okay, like here is the way we should approach going across the organization, growing into another department, and then expanding from 200 to 500 to 1,000. So we tend to try and like map it to the customer journey.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, it can basically depend on, I guess, what the like percent penetration or like that possibility. You know, and what about you, Brendan? What are you seeing with clients? Like, how are they managing this team? You know, this kind of team dynamic or handoff, because, you know, is new business handing it? Is it new business? You know what I mean? Like, how do you see other people handling this?
Yep, I see it across the board. At Zoom, for instance, the BDR, there was over 100, it's about 150 BDRs, and they did net new sales. They also did upsell and cross sells. So you might have, you know, a huge company, I don't know, whatever, IBM, who has, you know, technically in Salesforce, they've got the box checked and it's customer, but they're paying $100 a month, right? The reality is they could be paying $100,000 a month. Somebody should be responsible for going into that account, in this case, IBM, and upselling or cross-selling, or even just getting more licenses than they currently have without selling any other product and expanding the product suite within that company. So yeah, I really see it kind of across the board. I think I wouldn't even necessarily recommend one particular way as the best practice, but I do think you need to think about this, and you need to think about who owns this. You know, when that sale happens. I've also seen you know, a company that the AE closes the deal, and then that AE owns the account for the first 6 months. I think that's a good way to kind of align incentives and make sure that the AE isn't just throwing a deal across the fence, but they're also, you know, kind of incentivized to expand that deal once they close it, right? This is where kind of the classic land and expand is, it, you know, comes into play. Is like, okay, let's get that $100 credit card swipe, let's get through, you know, procurement, but then let's actually get them implemented, show them value, and then we can, you know, increase the penetration into that account.
Yeah, I've seen that in enterprise sales in general, where there's a percent period where, you know, like you keep the account because you've, you know, done XYZ, or they've, you know, you've got them to commit to some type of proof of concept. So then you know, you're going to kind of keep and hold on to it. All right, guys. Well, look, as we kind of start to wrap up, I think this has been helpful. I mean, like kind of my takeaways here, I've been jotting down some things are, you know, there's a lot of things that aren't that different. You know, there's a lot of things in terms of like best practices, you know, Nick, some of the things that you talked about, you know, kind of gathering information, you know, understanding, you know, kind of the right levers for that org and what's top of mind and bringing that up. I think obviously the good part is the PLG, you've got people who are a step above just, you know, people not using the product. And I think some of the ways you talked about these kind of team structures and growth, I think is also similar. But again, there's all these things that are different too, which is, you know, how do they leverage these intent signals, you know, to then make it. Now, the other piece that I would see being different, and kind of my last question to both of you is, how is the sales org, or who's responsible for generating more users, you know, versus we got the roll up deal? Is that sales still, or is that product? Is that marketing? Like, how do you think about, you know, infiltrating an account at like the bottom, you know, and like really building a bottoms up strategy?
Yeah, this is probably where PLG and classic enterprise software is different. In a PLG company, in a good PLG company, it should be a flywheel. So everyone is contributing to that flywheel. Marketing, doing awareness, leading to more top of funnel, free user signups. Product, increasing the conversion of those users into paid users. Sales, converting those small paid users into enterprise paid users. So I think it's really every part of the organization in a PLG team is contributing to the growth of an account. And I don't think it should be siloed, because yeah, everyone has a role to play. At different stages of the customer journey, a different team is sort of the leader. Like when you're really, really early, then yeah, it should be marketing because it's top of funnel.
Yeah.
Once they're in the product, then it's product. Once you've sold an early deal, then it should be sales and then customer success. But I think no one's role should ever, they shouldn't like step out like, oh, okay, I did the baton pass and now you go take it.
I think that's a great framework for it, Nick. I think that's a really good, like, simple way for people to think about it. And even if you're thinking and, about how you could structure it within your org, it's like, marketing and product are kind of, this is where we're spending a lot of our effort is to get to here. And then this is whenever we need marketing involvement. This is more human intervention. So, we're still doing some air cover. And then when it gets to this point, so I thought that was a great way to explain it. And Brendan, what about you, man? What are, like, how do you see these different responsibilities for getting that initial, product adoption or, infiltration into these accounts?
Yeah, I would say PLG will not work unless there's buy-in from the top. It has to be a top-down initiative at a company because you have to have those departments working together or it just does not work. If you're working in silos of product and marketing and sales and customer success are working in silos, that baton pass is going to break on the tooling side of things, on the enablement side of things, on the strategy side of things. This is where, like, I'd say, I've seen like this buzzword of like RevOps and like, what does RevOps mean? I think this is actually like a very practical way of like RevOps is someone that sales, marketing, and customer success rolls up into RevOps. They support all three of those departments as opposed to having sales ops and marketing ops. That is a silo. And so I think if you can build out a succinct strategy, tooling, and enablement across those departments, you're going to be successful implementing PLG. If you don't have that, it's going to be impossible, I would say. And I've seen this time and time again. Like if you don't have that executive buy-in to implement a strategy and the tooling around PLG, it's just going to fall flat if there's just one department trying to do it.
Yeah, or you're going to get different like Frankenstein motions throughout the org. Again, Canva's one that comes to mind. I don't know how many of you know the story of Canva, but Canva is obviously, I would argue, the most successful PLG company ever, like top 3 PLG companies, I would say, in like our like recent era. And what they did is then they went enterprise. They started to do this, but they kind of reverted to old school enterprise. It's like, there was like, okay, well, sales is going to be doing all of the tip of the spear for this stuff. And then after like a year and a half, they're like, okay, that's not it. Like we've got to kind of integrate and really build it across. And even at the enterprise sector, we still have to keep some of these principles and keep these groups aligned versus, kind of traditional. So I think this is really, kind of really, really great advice, for everyone. So for all of you out there that maybe coming into this, you're like, what the hell was PLG? I think we definitely have kind of talked through that. And I think hopefully we've given some both, kind of strategic tips into how to think about structuring the organization, who should be involved, down to the tactical of like how to get these people involved and take it up the chain. So Nick, big thank you for the, kind of both mix of strategy that you see and the tactical advice in terms of what you're living. And I think Brendan, obviously, your vantage point from, being in the industry and talking to so many people is invaluable. So thank you guys for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Jake. Appreciate it.
Love it. All right, everyone. Well, thank you. I'm going to be off next week, so I will not see you live on LinkedIn or on Zoom next week, which is going to be a nice little break. And we will see everyone, I guess, whenever I come back to it the week after. Definitely make sure to follow these two guys. They both put out really strong content, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.